The Salem Witch Trials took place in 1692 in Bay Colony, Massachusetts. Throughout history, we have been told about what happened and why it happened and explained what led up to those events. There are many different stories about what happened, and throughout time, those stories change. Some still stick to the original, and some put their own input in about what they think happened. There were 3 mass executions. The first mass execution was on July 19, 1692, when 5 women were hung as witches. Over time, the story wasn't always told the same. There are many controversial views on the Salem Witch Trials. I have a few primary sources to show how the story is told different now versus then. I have found several articles and news clippings about the Salem Witch Trials that took place in 1692. As time passes, the stories aren't always told the same, and they may change, like I said. The examples that I will be showing is just how much they changed over these years. I will argue how the story changes over time and how some people stop caring less and less as time goes on, because I feel that in their minds, they didn't have to live through it, so why should it matter about what really happened? So they just start to care less and less. I have read many articles, and there are only a few that give more details than others. Some are very detailed, and some stick to one paragraph and just give you a little background. Elizabeth Parris was 9 years old, and Abigail Williams was 11 years old when they claimed to be possessed by the devil because local witches did this to them. Dorothy Good was the youngest accused, including her mother was accused as well. The accusation of these witches causes many arrests, court hearings, and executions. In 1711, the colony passed a bill pardoning anyone that was accused. Because, come to find out, some that they claimed were witches weren't actually witches. They were falsely accused of dealing with witchcraft, and they were hung for their crimes that they did not commit. In the online article of the U.S. News and World Report, there is much less detail given. It does tell you that 5 women were hung in 1692, which started the mass executions of that time. The names of the victims are told, but not the age or how and why they thought they were witches or using witchcraft. Some of my primary sources are articles that I found online, and I have 2 sources that I found from a book. TheHistory.com explains the Salem Witch Trials as, in the beginning of the article, they give a brief summary of the Salem Witch Trials, and as you scroll down, they provide context and origins of the Salem Witch Trials and the belief of how it all began in Europe as early as the 14th century, and how it dates way back to then and is not only started in 1692. It mentions the hysteria that spreads and the conclusion and the legacy that was left. My second source is by Stacy Schiff in her book called The Witches, Salem 1692. It begins to tell the story in the harsh winter of Bay Colony, Massachusetts. In 1692, 14 women, 5 men, and 2 dogs were accused and executed for witchcraft. It is said some innocents were hung for their crimes they did not commit. It was later said that Massachusetts had about 700 witches flying about. The Salem Witch Trials represent one of the only times, besides suffrage, when women played a central role in American history. And another book source I have called Satan in Salem by Benjamin C. Ray. Ray aims for colonial context of 1692. He relies heavily on primary records, case records, including dispositions, and also including journals from pastors and what they have wrote about what happened during those times. His approach is not to reinterpret the events, but to permit the subjects to talk about their own understanding of what took place. He presents his work in a chronological order, beginning with when the new pastor Samuel Parris arrives in Massachusetts and his initiative. In an article called 5 Killed in Salem Witch Hunt Remembered on the 325th Anniversary, the author gives a very brief summary, and he describes it as the first of 3 hangings when Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds were hung at Proctor's Ledge. A few ministers and higher authorities give a quote about their opinions of what happened 325 years ago in Salem. Like I said, this is an example of a very short article that was given. Another article called The Witchcraft Trials in Salem, an account, is a website that talks about famous trials that happened throughout history. And to give a summary of basically what was told, it says one of the most famous trials, known as the Salem Witch Trials, that happened is described as Salem was in the midst of change when accusations began. So that's basically all it says in the article. Is just it talks about some of the changes that were happening, and the town was in the midst of changes, and that's why so many were accused. There is also a Salem Witch Museum, and in that website there is an article called the 1692 Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Museum is all about teaching history of the events that actually happened, and it has a brief 4-paragraph summary of the witch trials that occurred in Salem and those that were accused. Stacy Schiff shares 5 myths that were believed to be true in the witch trials. 1. The convicted witches were burned. Nobody was burned, there were executions. People were hung for their crimes. The victims were all women. This is not true because, as in other articles say, men were accused, even dogs were accused. The panic took, which basically is saying that everybody was panicking. I mean, which is kind of true, people were panicking, but that the panic took, so a lot of people got executed. 4. The superstition was the driving force. Superstition may have been a part of it, but I wouldn't say it was the driving force of the situation. And 5. The ergot poisoning was to blame for the witch trials. In a brief video that was under 3 minutes that I watched on YouTube called The Salem Witch Trials 1692 Cartoons, they give a summary and a background of what happened at the Salem Witch Trials and what led up to those events. It also describes how and why young girls were convicted of witchcraft. In that video, even though it was very brief and under 3 minutes, I thought it did a pretty good job and gave you a very good background of what happened, like you read in most articles, about the girls that were accused, how it led up for them to be accused, and the people that were executed, and what happened later on after all the Salem witch trials ended. There are also websites I found that provided real articles and news clippings and court journals from what happened in 1692. And they are very long, and they give you pretty much what actually happened. They go into detail. Some of the court cases were like hundreds of pages long. Some of people's journals that they had, the news clippings, they just went to explain everything in depth. And I think that was by far one of the best primary sources I have found with the website. They even have record books from the Salem churches and the Salem village that are provided. They have made an index to make it easier to search through all the documents. So let's say you want to look up a certain person, Sarah Good. You can look her up by her last name, just press the G, and that's how you find it. And it will show you all the court cases that her name pops up in, or accusations, or anything like that, even for the other people that were involved. I also found timelines that provided accusations and examinations of those accused, and it is provided with detail and a photo of the original documents and deposition of Abigail Williams versus George Jacobs. It's discussed in detail of the formal persecutions performed in the courts. In my opinion, I think it is very important to discuss the Salem witch trials and what took place and what happened back then. And like I said in the beginning, it is very important to our history, and it has been told differently. But it's important to understand why it happened and the accusations that took place. And I think so many people were afraid after the few girls got accused that they just started blaming anybody and everybody that they could, so that their town could be pure and clean of witchcraft and all this craziness.